Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Total Survey Design Podcast. My name is Dr. Azdren Coma. Today's episode is about collecting data from a target population that may speak two or more languages. This is the first part of a two-part series. Stay tuned for the next episode when I will be speaking to Dr. Ruben Angel Arias Rueda, who is the project manager at the Social and Economic Sciences Research Center, mainly focusing on surveys conducted in both English and Spanish. Now let's get to today's episode. The goal of any survey designer ought to be to create a survey that collects the best data possible, whether that's a survey collecting data on healthcare outcomes or even a national census. This means that people taking the survey in different languages are not answering a question differently simply because they are taking the survey in a different language. In other words, good survey design means being mindful of measurement equivalence, which means ensuring the responses mean the same thing across languages. Every time a survey is conducted in multiple languages, there is a risk of generating biased data, whether it comes from translation error, cultural differences, or simply designing a different survey in different languages. Creating a survey that targets a multilingual population is not just a matter of translating the survey using something like Google Translate. Ideally, you have someone who doesn't just speak the language of your target population, but also understands the culture. Sometimes, translating literally a question and response options doesn't have the same meaning in different languages, which means that a good survey is designed in a way that will collect the same data in more than one language. Sometimes this means that if you're designing your questionnaire in English, you might have to change some of your questions to ensure that the Spanish version is asking the same thing. This also means that your questionnaire will likely go through several drafts until it works in all of your target languages. But before you worry about the subtleties of language, you really need to ensure that the experience of taking the survey is the same regardless of which language the respondent speaks. This means that everything from your first contact to your instructions to the response options is all presented the same, regardless of the language. I have a case study that I want to share, which is very personal to me. I want to discuss issues with the North Macedonia 2021 Census. This case was also the topic of my semester project when taking Don Dillman's survey practicum class. While I cataloged a plethora of issues with many aspects of the survey, in this podcast episode, I will only focus on issues brought on specifically by surveying a population that speaks more than one language. To give you a bit of background about the census, North Macedonia has an Albanian minority population that is something between a quarter and a third of the whole population. Many Albanians do not speak Macedonian, which is the language spoken most widely in Macedonia. Also important to know is that Macedonia is written in Cyrillic, which is similar and looks like the Russian alphabet, whereas written Albanian is based on the Latin alphabet, so the same letters as in English. Something noteworthy is that while the Macedonian government is required to provide documents and conduct business in Albanian, and while it doesn't always happen, if the goal is to get an accurate census of the population, it really shouldn't matter if the language is an official government language or not. If there are people completing the survey that don't understand your survey, your goal ought to be to figure out how you can reach those people, whether they speak Albanian, Macedonian, Turkish, or some other language. Also noteworthy is that, since a large proportion of the country is migrants to other places, often migrating for economic opportunities for 3 or 6 months at a time, the 2021 census had an online self-enumeration option that was available only for citizens living abroad, which is how I accessed it from the US. In other words, the online version was not available to residents physically within North Macedonia, which is an odd choice in and of itself, but that's also a topic for another day. Also, whether or not to count people temporarily living abroad is another debate when it comes to conducting a national census. But that debate aside, I am sharing this just to say that this is how I accessed the whole census survey while living in the United States. While I think that the 2020 Macedonia census was problematic in many ways, I thought it was problematic, especially for respondents who did not understand Macedonian, and particularly for those who did not read Cyrillic writing. So, for example, while the survey did offer respondents the option to select their own language when taking the survey, many issues still remained, such as questions or phrases that were translated word for word from Macedonian into Albanian, which were grammatically incorrect in Albanian and which were difficult to understand. Question response options that were not even translated from Cyrillic into other languages, and survey information and help that was not translated into other languages. An example of the literal translations. One question in the census asked respondents about their equivalent of the county and the city, except that in their English translation, they used the words municipality and settlement. It took me a moment to realize that by settlement they meant city. But what got me most about both the county and the city questions is that even though the questions themselves were translated into the 7 languages they offered in the survey, the response options that were in the drop-down menu were all in Cyrillic. Keep in mind that most, if not all, cities and towns in Macedonia have signs that are both in Cyrillic and Latin letters. And while it might be relatively easy for non-Cyrillic readers to recognize their own town's name in Cyrillic, this survey made the same translation blunder when asking a question about the respondent's profession. And while I can read and write in Cyrillic, and I feel like I could speak relatively fluent in Macedonian, I admit that I cannot discuss technical topics, business, or any jargony topics in Macedonian. So when it came time for me to select a profession that most closely matched my own, I was stuck. Furthermore, the way the drop-down menu is programmed, the web browser's built-in translator would also not be able to help translate the response options that were in Cyrillic. And I couldn't even copy and paste the list into a translator. From a data analysis perspective, what this means to me is that in the 2021 Macedonia Census, researchers might have great data for the professions of people who are fluent in understanding technical Cyrillic, but not for everyone else. And that's a huge problem because everyone else is a large proportion of the population. The overall goal of conducting a survey in multiple languages is that we want to minimize the cognitive burden and the ambiguity for all groups of respondents. You should strive to reduce barriers to participation in the survey for all language speakers from the very first point of contact. Here are some translation principles to keep in mind. Small wording differences can produce large measurement differences. This means that we need to be very cautious about things like subtle differences in intensity in response options, such as with somewhat versus fairly. The goal of translation is not a word-for-word matching, but a conceptual equivalence across languages. This includes not just the question, but the response scales and the answer categories as well. It is essential for surveys administered in multiple languages to be extensively pre-tested to ensure that the meaning of it and interpretation of questions are consistent across all survey versions. When pilot testing the respondents, look for things like misinterpretation, hesitation, or confusion, and even unexpected different response patterns. Also keep in mind that some groups may respond better to interview-administered modes, such as via phone or face-to-face, versus a self-administered survey on paper or over the web. The question order must remain the same across languages. Also, visual cues, such as bolding or spacing, should guide all users similarly. You must also ensure that there is a parallel visual structure and not just translated text. And remember, all communication must be translated, including invitations, instructions, and reminders. And finally, be cautious when combining data across languages. That does it for today's episode. Don't forget to be on the lookout for part 2 in this series. If you found this episode useful, please do me a favor and give this podcast a positive rating. Also, if you'd like to email me, you can always do so at totalsurveydesign@gmail.com. Have a great day.